the hills at Epidaurus, about 100 miles from Athens, the 14,000-seat theatre has dazzled audiences for 2,500 years. It is a feat of engineering. 55 rows of stone seats built into the hillside with such precision that the theatre has perfect acoustics.
This theatre at Epidaurus is quite simply the most special theatrical space in the Western world. It's the largest of all the surviving ancient theatres. It's the most beautiful. This is somewhere where the spirit of the god of drama, Dionysus, still lives on.
Surprisingly, the reason for siting the theatre in this remote place has its origin in medicine. Next to the theatre was a vast healing centre, and to the ancient Greeks, theatre was medicine.
One way of trying to understand the link between the healing cult and this particularly exquisite theatre is that for the ancient Greeks, music, and Greek theatre is a fundamentally musical experience, was actually used in medical therapy. The great philosopher Aristotle actually writes about how people who are distressed and psychologically disturbed can come to a great resolution of that and to a much happier state of mind by listening to certain kinds of music and watching certain kinds of performance.
At the adjacent healing centre, the god of medicine, Asclepios, and his magical snakes were said to work miracles. Medical cures and remedies were inscribed on stone tablets. Shrines were built to the cult of Asclepios, and the center developed into a wealthy healing sanctuary. People came from across the empire to cure every ailment and disability. In 360 BC, the money collected from patients was used to build a vast theater. The architect, Polykleitos, had already built a roundhouse at the sanctuary, but now set about a far grander circular design. He chose a bowl-shaped site facing west so the rising sun would light up the landscape behind the stage. He dug out the round performance space before creating the huge seating area known as the gazing space. Thousands of limestone blocks cut from local quarries formed the seats. His design was for 32 rows, although 23 more were added 2 centuries later. Behind the actors was the scaena, the origin of the word scene, a 2-story stage building which was painted as a backdrop for the play. The scaena also enabled early special effects. When a play required a god to descend from the heavens, an actor was flown in on a hoist. The masked performers often played to audiences of up to 14,000 without the benefit of microphones. Polykleitos was able to create perfect acoustics. Even a coin being dropped at the center of the performance circle can be heard clearly in the back rows. The design of the theatre also enhances the sound of the human voice. The secret lies in how sounds are reflected by the stone itself, reducing the amount of distorting echo.
A sound is produced by somebody's mouth. It will hit a wall, that's a reflection. And what they've done in Epidaurus in order to create a large quantity of short reflections is that they've broken up the surface. There is no surface which is flat. So when a sound hits a wall, it's diffused in many, many directions. It enhances the original sound by kind of stretching it a little bit longer than it already is.
And in the quest for perfection, the Greeks developed another technique to make the sound even clearer.
When somebody speaks in a theatre, you can hear resonances, and if you have an ear for it, you know which resonances are going to get in the way of the dialogue. So if you were to find something that can take those resonances out, then you're laughing. And that's exactly what they tried to do. They used a resonator, which they would tune to the frequencies that they wanted to take out and to the reflections they wanted to take out. And they would embed them in the wall.
2,500 years later, the theatre is still entrancing audiences. The place that has inspired for millennia remains one of the world's finest theatres. The ancient Greeks produced some of the most astonishing buildings in history. but it was on the small island of Rhodes that a giant was created. The islanders set themselves an unprecedented technical challenge to engineer a statue of superhuman proportions. The Colossus once guarded the harbor to the island of Rhodes. It stood for nearly a century and was one of the ancient wonders of the world. At 110 feet high, it was nearly as tall as the Statue of Liberty, built over 2,000 years later. The story of the Colossus began in 305 BC, when a powerful enemy fleet began a year-long siege of the small island of Rhodes. The attackers far outnumbered the small island's population, but against all odds, the islanders defeated them. To celebrate their surprising victory, the Rhodians decided to build a giant bronze statue of their sun god, Helios. A local sculptor, Hares of Lindos, was given the challenge of building a statue nearly twice as tall as any ever built. Construction took 12 long years of hard labor and 200 tons of bronze. To begin, the architect, Hares, had to work out where best to build the statue.
Well, as an engineer, the key considerations the sculptor would need to think about in finding a location for the Colossus would be, firstly, the visibility. It would have to be in a prominent position overlooking the harbour. Secondly, it would need a really strong rock foundation to be built upon.
Early representations of the Colossus show the statue astride the harbour.
Well, the old harbour here at Rhodes is in a natural bay, but still the mouth of the harbour is very large compared to the height of the Colossus. This tower on the right of the harbour mouth is about the height that the Colossus was, and you can see how ridiculous it would be that it could stand astride the harbour mouth with its legs at an impossible angle, very difficult to support.
Recent archaeological finds have now convinced experts that the Colossus stood on the hill overlooking the bay, where a medieval castle now stands. Further evidence of a sanctuary to the sun god Helios near the castle suggests that this was where the Colossus had once stood. There was no precedent for a statue of this size, so at every stage of construction, Hares was taking a step further into the unknown. He decided to build a wooden frame over which he would hang beaten bronze panels. Starting at the feet and working upwards, the Colossus was supported by a mound of earth as it grew to over 100 feet high. The island of Rhodes was renowned for its bronze work, which was a major export. But because the Colossus was so large, the entire casting pit could only make one small section at a time.
We have evidence from around the time that the Colossus was built that the Rhodians were experts in bronze work. This is one of the largest bronze casting pits ever found from ancient Greece, and it proves that the Rhodians were able to make large, hollow bronze pieces. It works a bit like a kiln. They would fashion a large block of clay, and then by placing wax around the outside in a thin layer and more clay outside that, they could create the shape that they wanted to cast. They would pack earth down around the whole structure and then fire the clay from beneath using fires in the bottom of the pit. That would then set the clay into the shape of the form. The wax would be drained out and the liquid bronze poured in from the top.
Hundreds of these pieces were cast and carried up the growing mountain to be attached to the wooden framework. Stones were dropped down inside to give stability. But after 12 years of construction, when the earth was removed, how could Hares be sure that the Colossus would stand up?
To support a human shape with two legs, a sculptor might use a third support, disguised in some way, something draped down to the ground, through which they can have a third leg, essentially, for the structure to stand.
Whatever technique he used, Hares' masterpiece withstood the elements for nearly 60 years. But in 224 BC, there occurred one natural force the Colossus could not survive.
An earthquake doesn't just shake it backwards and forwards. but it would also twist it. And twisting the top of the tripod would break the connections between the legs, and at that point, given that the ankles are secured in the ground, it's the knees that are going to be the weak point, and that's where it would buckle.
The people of Rhodes consulted an oracle, which warned that to rebuild the Colossus would bring them misfortune. So the giant statue lay in pieces for over 1,000 years, until finally the bronze was sold for scrap. The Greeks had long excelled at creating incredible statuary. At Olympia, the holy sanctuary was dominated by the world's largest ivory statue to the god Zeus, the god of all gods. But long before this statue was made, another brand of superhero was also making Olympia famous, the Olympic champion. And Olympia would become the most enduring sports arena, not just across the Greek Empire, but for centuries afterwards across the world. Olympia was the only place in the Greek world where both gods and men were worshipped. In July every 4th year, from all corners of the Greek world, thousands made their way to Olympia to compete in and to watch the greatest spectacle on earth. The Olympic Games began as early as the 8th century BC with a 200-yard sprint. Held to mark a truce between two warring cities, it launched over 1,000 years of games. As the games grew in importance, the sanctuary of Zeus was transformed into the world's first sporting city, with training centers, baths, guest houses, and a stadium which could hold 40,000 spectators. Beneath this arch would run the finest athletes from across the Greek world. The games would decide on just one victor, whose reward was honor in the name of the god Zeus. The earliest race was 200 meters long. Later came the 400, then the 5,000 meters, and then there was the pentathlon, running, jumping, wrestling, discus, and javelin.
So many of the events of Olympia were versions of war. Men throwing spears, men throwing stones, men racing in hoplite armor, in heavy military equipment.
Competitors were gradually reduced to just a final pair who would fight it out in wrestling and boxing combat, but only the elite could afford to take part.
To go to Olympia meant you had to train for 10 months and then train for 1 month at Olympia itself. That wasn't for ordinary Greeks, that was for the very wealthy.
Olympia soon grew into a vast sports complex, its buildings designed specifically for each athletic discipline. As Olympia soared in importance, shrines and temples were built to glorify and honor Zeus. But at Olympia, champions were also honored with the first gymnasium, and next door, a school for wrestlers and boxers. But there were other, more unusual events housed in specially designed buildings. A contest for trumpeters and heralds was held at one end of an echo colonnade, an elongated building which could echo each note 7 times. There was the hippodrome, where chariot and horse racing events took place. Each race began with the horses being released from an elaborate starting mechanism called an aphesis to ensure total fairness. The horses raced out into the hippodrome, nearly 800 meters long. An average lap was nearly 1/3 of a mile.
The Greek who won at the Olympic Games didn't get a medal of precious metal. All he got was a ribbon around his head, a palm branch to wave around the stadium, and an olive wreath to take home. But his real reward started when he got home. He was allowed his pick of the spectacular heiresses in the town. He'd get a meal, a good meal at public expense for the rest of his life, and over it all, the fame, who would be smiled at and pointed at